Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Okay, so we are into the third video for this chapter so far, Repetition for Itself. And today we're going to be looking at the third synthesis of time. But before we get to that, there's a little bit of background we have to look at regarding Descartes and Kant. So first of all, Deleuze wants to talk about Descartes. So the issue here is the cogito and Descartes' famous "I think, therefore I am." And so Deleuze says this has two values. What Deleuze calls the determination and the undetermined. So the determination is the "I think." Think of it like a specific, something specifically determined. And the undetermined is the "I am," or existence, if you like, and just something that is general without specification, without kind of any individual particular focus. And that's what I've written next. The undetermined, the "I am," is more a general form of existence, which precedes the more specific determination that comes in the "I think." And for Descartes, this meant that the cogito was divided into two substances, being and thinking, or res extensa and res cogitans. Nice, so that was Descartes. Then Deleuze moves on to look at Kant. And so Kant came in regarding this idea with a critique. His first critique of pure reason, in which he objects that the determination cannot bear directly on the undetermined. Rather, it must be mediated through a third term, which Deleuze calls the determinable. Okay, so we've got these three terms. It's good to get familiar with them because they're a key part of this little section. The determination, again, the "I think," that's the specific, something that is determined. I mean, exactly like what it says, something that's specifically identified, if you like, or particularized out of a more general state of existence. Then the undetermined, which is this general state of existence, nothing specific in it, nothing particular. And Kant's insight was that the determination, the "I think," cannot bear directly on this, the undetermined, the "I am," or existence. It has to be mediated through a third term, which Deleuze calls the determinable. And in Kant, and in Deleuze actually, but in Kant first, this is time. So time is this mediating factor. And Kant calls time, in fact, the form of all inner sense. And it has kind of a special meaning. It's a bit more of a privileged role to play in Kant's philosophy than space, which is the other half of the transcendental aesthetic. So time is a little bit special, and that's why. It's this link. It's this... space is also part of the link, but time is just more intrinsic. I think it's more closely connected to the self. So just before we look at what Deleuze has to say about this, in general terms, just regarding Kant's philosophy, the idea was that Kant's the Copernican revolution that he brought about was the way that the mind brings structure to an originally unstructured reality. And that structure then comes in the form of time, space, and the categories. And that is determination. That's what would figure as determination, and what we've been calling determination here. A kind of particularizing. So structure is brought to structure, as in determination, particularization, is brought to bear on an originally unstructured reality, which is the undetermined. And the key point to understand here is that what is undetermined, the existence or the thing in itself, can only be determined through time, space, and those categories. Thus, for Kant, there is a transcendental split here into a noumenal domain and a phenomenal domain. The realm of the thing in itself and the realm of appearances. And you can see how that kind of parallels what Descartes did, but there's just a little bit more going on with Kant. So that's in terms of a kind of a general look at what Kant was doing and how it fits into this determination, undetermined, determinable model of Deleuze's. But if we go down to the level of the individual, so looking at the I, for example, or the mind, then we can say that to the what Kant is doing is to the I think and the I am, to the determination and the undetermined, we are adding a passive self, and this is the determinable. Thus, my undetermined existence can be determined only within time as the existence of a phenomenon, of a passive, receptive, phenomenal subject appearing within time. Okay, so we've taken it from this kind of general formulation that Kant had and we're applying it to the individual, to the I. And here we see that my undetermined existence can only be determined in time, in exactly the same way that we saw at the general level that structure can only come about, can only be brought to bear on the originally unstructured reality through the imposition of time, space, and the categories. And Deleuze is just focusing on time because that's his concern here. But like I said, time does have a kind of a privileged role to play in Kant regarding the self and the I. So it makes sense to focus on this more than the others. So my undetermined existence can only be determined in time. Time is the mediating factor which allows myself to be determined within this originally undetermined reality. So we've got that split again. The split is enacted again as it was at that general level. But here, since it's related to the self or the I, Deleuze calls this the fracture of the I. And it's fractured by the pure and empty form of time. It's fractured by time. And the pure and empty form of time, we'll look at, that comes up a little bit later when we get to the third synthesis. We'll look at what that means in a bit more detail. But for now, just it's fractured by time. And that's saying nothing more than time is what allows the two realms to be connected. It's what mediates those two domains. So thought is, as it was in Descartes, distinguished from being. I think from I am. But instead of resulting in substance, two different substances, Kant's distinction, Kant's split is a transcendental one. So we have the noumenal self, which I think in Kant would be called the apperception. This is, he says, who we are, distinguished from the phenomenal self, which Kant calls the inner sense, and this is how we appear to ourselves. But because the form of our inner sense is time, because ourselves, as we know them, as they're determined, can only appear for us with the can only appear for us structured by the form of time, then Kant says, I have no knowledge of myself as I am, but only as I appear to myself. And that's just because in order for who I am to be determined out of this originally undetermined existence, it has to be mediated through time. It has to appear under the structuring form of time. The other thing I wanted to say about this is just regarding the passive self. And the first thing to note is that the passive self is added to the I think and the I am, is added, the passive self, but it's not really added, which this makes it sound like it's coming in from outside, where we're bringing something in from outside and adding it to the situation. That's not what's happening. Rather, it's just how the undetermined is determined. It's the result of this fracturing of the I. So rather than being added to the picture, it's kind of emerging from within it, from that central insight of Kant's, that the determination cannot bear directly on the undetermined, but must be mediated through time. And the other thing I wanted to say is, why passive? Why is this self passive? And the answer is that the self that we know, the only self that we can know ourselves as, is as a phenomenon, which means it's part of the phenomenal world, and the phenomenal world is subject to causality. It's subject to it's fully determined in the sense of not free, because it follows the law of cause and effect, is ironclad within the phenomenal realm. And so that's why it's passive, because it appears without any kind of freedom, without any kind of genuine agency. But that's only because it's appearing as an appearance, as a phenomenon within the phenomenal domain, under this category of time, under the structuring form of time. But anyway, that's why Deleuze calls this the phenomenal self. He calls it the passive self. And since Deleuze is always interested in difference, he points out, he's quick to point out where difference arises in this picture of Kant's. And it appears in two forms. In the first, there's a transcendental kind of difference. And this marks the division between the determination and the undetermined, or the phenomenal and the noumenal. So that's the first difference. And there's another difference that arises internally. And this difference, however, establishes a relation between those two, between thought and being. And that comes about through this passive self. So difference arises in two ways, transcendental and internal. The transcendental is a division, a split, and the internal establishes a relation between those two. Now, the problem with all of this is that it doesn't really fit in with Deleuze's model, in which the passive self, as we've seen, is constituted by the passive synthesis, i.e. not through a transcendental split. And so for Deleuze, Kant's transcendental distinction can't be maintained. And that means that we need a different picture, we need a different model, and that brings us to Deleuze's third synthesis of time. So Deleuze calls this third synthesis, the synthesis of time, the formal and empty order of time. Before we look at exactly what that means, the idea here, if we just try and put this whole thing in perspective, this whole chapter in perspective so far, is we've gone from this first synthesis of habit, which was the foundation of time. We moved to the second synthesis of memory, which was the ground of time. And now we're at this third synthesis, which is time itself. So we've finally come to time, and this time is grasped through the I or the self. So that's how we're going to be approaching time, what this third synthesis is doing. And if you note the progression, we've gone from habit to memory to the I or the self. And that's a progression from basically the less minded to the more minded. We're kind of moving from basic organics to sentient beings. And that's really the arc that I see in this first part of this chapter, with these three different syntheses. So, okay, the formal and empty order of time, what is this? Well, first of all, it's empty. So the formal and empty order of time, it's empty because it's formal. I.e., we're interested in the form of change, not what is changing. So not the content, but the form, the structure. And that's why Deleuze calls this the formal and empty order of time. And that means that this is going to be a static account of time. And that's interesting. That's the exact opposite of how we normally think about time, right? We always imagine time as moving. We think of a river, or we put up a container, the so-called block theory of time, of the universe, in which space-time is a container, and the movement comes from us moving through this container. But that's not how Deleuze is going to. That's not how he envisions time, and he's right. I think time can't be understood as something that flows. That's not a good. It's not a good metaphysical picture of time. That's a good phenomenological picture, but if you want to understand time metaphysically, it's going to be static. It's not going to flow in any way. And that's so it's static because time itself doesn't move or change. Again, the form, the structure, time itself doesn't move or change. What's in it moves and changes, the content, but the form itself doesn't. And that kind of maps onto what I was saying about the metaphysical versus the phenomenological. The phenomenological deals with the content, right? Deals with an individual experience. So a perspective within the whole. Whereas metaphysics deals with the whole itself. So time, this formal and empty order of time, is static. Nice. It is then not logical, I wouldn't say. So Ray Brassier in Nihil Unbound calls this logical, and I don't think I'd go that far. I don't think that's the right word to use. Definitely don't think Deleuze would use it. So not logical, but you can see what Brassier is getting at. And I wouldn't call it intellectual either, which brings to mind kind of a deliberate, intentional aspect. So we don't deliberately bring about this third synthesis of time. We don't bring about time, but it certainly arises. It only arises through beings like human beings, through relatively complex organisms. Therefore, it is subjective. Again, although prior to that, an individual's specific thought. So it is subjective in the sense that it only applies to beings like human beings, beings that can be thought of as subjects. It only arises through such beings. And again, then we see something that I remember saying a couple of videos back, this means that time, this third synthesis, it's not in the natural world. It's not in the world itself. It's in the world only through complex creatures like human beings. It only arises when you have the conditions, or the conditions are right, such that we have the foundation of time and the ground of time. Time itself can only arise on top of that, after those prior conditions have been satisfied. So I think it's right to say that this third synthesis of time is subjective, but obviously not in a subjective objective kind of opinion sense of the word subjective, but subjective in the sense that it can only apply or arise through a subject, i.e. a human being. So then I think, what is this formal and empty order of time? What's it all about? What's happening? And I think it's fair to say that this is about the emergence of mind, the emergence of a subject. It is essentially determination arising in the indeterminate. Right? It's that I think arising in the midst of the I am, thought arising in being. And so that's why I said the arc here I can see in this chapter is from less minded to more minded, from basic organics to sentient beings. And this is the final step. So how does this whole process, how does this emergence take place? Well, basically, time fractures the I. And so we've got this idea of fracturing again. But to distinguish it, perhaps to distinguish his from Kant's fracture, Deleuze calls this the caesura. So this time fractures the I. Deleuze's caesura, what does that mean? Well, it doesn't fracture it into substance like Descartes did, nor does it fracture it by means of a transcendental split like Kant did. Rather, it divides the I into a past and a future, into a before and an after. But this is not empirical, so it's not related to the content of the I, and it's not dynamic. There's no flow, there's no movement from past to future, or from the future to the past, if we're thinking about time as a river, for example. Rather, this whole picture is fixed and formal. It's static. And I should have mentioned this earlier, but when Deleuze says time fractures the I, that I should, I think, be thought of as the I am. So it's not an individual I here, which is being fractured. It's the I am of existence, which is being fractured, and this brings about the I think. In the same way that we saw with Descartes and Kant, but just with Deleuze's take on it, where the division is not into substance or transcendence, but into a past and a future. But again, static, formal. So this caesura then is more like an ordering operation, a structure or a structuring framework, which is imposed on this original undetermined, the I am. And so I think of this in the same way that we discussed it with Kant. This is like a making sense of reality. It's what allows reality now, this originally undetermined, it's what allows it to make sense. Because now, for the first time, we can talk about the split. We can talk about the past and the future. And it's that which makes life possible. right? Which makes intellectual, cognitive life possible. Cognitive, sentient life possible. Well, without that split, without this caesura, there's just no way that there's no way you can talk about sentient life. It's an absolute prerequisite for that. And that's why I think this split, this fracturing of the I of Deleuze's is essentially the emergence of cognition, a higher level of mind. And to that end, Deleuze says that the caesura is, or he says the I is fractured according to the order of time. So there's that sense of bringing order, imposing structure, imposing therefore a determination on this originally undetermined existence. So this third synthesis, this formal and empty order of time, which fractures the I, the caesura, and divides the I, the I am, into a past and a future, in the sense of an ordering kind of operation. This can be understood both as a totality and as a series. So if we understand this as a totality, what we get is a static synthesis of before and after, an ordered whole. No movement, nothing dynamic about this. We get kind of a fixed ordering, structuring picture. And the totality here is, I think, either, or can be either the I itself, so a person, an individual, or it can be in the sense of a broader historical sense, so extending beyond, say, your own life. Although when I say the word history, historical, not in the sense of not the historian's history. That sounds maybe a little bit strange, but we'll talk about that in a moment. But the basic idea is that it's not the history that a historian kind of chronicles. It's not that kind of reflective, conceptualized, fact-based accounting of history. It's history as we would live it, as we understand ourselves in relation to it. Anyway, the idea is this totality can be understood in both of those terms: a totality of you, the I, or this totality of this broader totality of the historical context within which your life takes place. And Deleuze stresses here that this totality is a symbolic image. And that's an interesting thing to say here. The first thing I would say is that this links back to what I said about this being subjective. So that the idea that the totality, the caesura, time understood as a totality, is a symbolic image, means that we are dealing with the subjective, with something that is, if not a subject, at least capable of becoming a subject. It only arises for such an entity. And it also seems to be setting Deleuze up for where he wants to go later with psychoanalysis. And we'll look at that in the next video, but that's something for later. So anyway, this whole, this totality, the static synthesis, before and afters, befores and afters, as an ordered whole, that's a symbolic image. And so the other way we can look at time here is as a series. And when we talk about the series, Deleuze says the self appears here. So distinguishing between the I and the self appears here, but it appears as divided. Divided according to the temporal series. And the idea here is that we come up with this, we come into a confrontation with the idea of a symbolic image. So again, the symbolic image comes into play here, but now in the midst of a kind of confrontation and engagement with of the self with it. So it's interesting just to note too, and I don't mention this anywhere else, I think, that we now have then this fracture of the I and this divided self. So those are two interesting metaphors that Deleuze brings out. And what is this divided self? Well, actually, before we get into that, just as a distinction, a way of thinking about the totality and the series, the totality is more, I said global. It's kind of more abstracted from time. So it's a big picture, if you like. It takes in the whole of the life or history itself. It takes in the whole at a glance, if you like. Whereas the self is more lived within time, plunged into a situation. So it gets, and because of that, because of it's plunged into a concrete situation, then we have this confrontation, and we get, according to the caesura, that split into before and future, we get this division. The self gets divided. So how does it get divided? That's what we want to look at next. So it's divided into three, and again, this is through a direct encounter with some actual lived concrete situation. So the first division is Deleuze calls a first time, and this is the a priori, past or before. But, and this is crucial, this has nothing to do with whether the act has been performed or not. That is an empirical criterion, whether the act is completed or not. So it's to do with the content, not to do with time itself, the formal and empty order of time. So what does he mean then when he says the a priori, past or before? A past which is irrelevant, in which whether the act has been completed or not is irrelevant. What does that mean? He says that the image of the act is experienced as too big for me, which is I guess it kind of makes sense now that I've thought about it for so long. But when I first read this, I was like, what does this mean? How does this connect to the past? So the image of the act is experienced as too big for me. The quote then, he says, the first part of the symbol is lived in the past. One is in the past and lives oneself as such, so long as one experiences the image of the act as too big for oneself. This is how I understand this. He's referring here to your understanding of yourself in relation to the image of the act. For example, have you accepted that you can do it? Or if it's already been done, have you accepted that you've done it, that it's finished, that these are the consequences that apply, that follow from having performed that act? Have you fully taken it on into yourself now that you've done it? Have you kind of fully accepted it? Or are you kind of stuck in the past? Have you not moved beyond that act yet? Even though it's finished, have you not really been able to incorporate it assimilate it into your life? So it's like a kind of sticking point. And that has a nice psychoanalytical overtone, which will definitely come about a little bit later in the next video. So this a priori past, this first time, is not to do with whether the act has been completed or not, and therefore in some kind of temporal past. Rather, it's where the act, whatever it is, hasn't been fully accepted yet. The act that you're contemplating hasn't been fully accepted, or the act that you've performed hasn't been fully accepted, and you're stuck on it. You're not able to move past it. And Deleuze's example, and we'll look at a full quote for this shortly, is starting a revolution. A classic, I think, Deleuzean example. Have you accepted that you can do this? That this is something which, are you ready to do this? Or if it's already been done, have you fully acknowledged what that means, what it means to have done that, to have completed that act? If you haven't, then that act is being experienced by you as too big for you, for yourself, too big for you still. So the first part of the symbol here is lived in the past, and this is the first time. The second time then is the caesura itself, and this is the present of metamorphosis, which, if the first time was the image of the act being experienced as too big for me, this is a becoming equal to the act. So here we've accepted it. Now we are engaged in it fully. We have acknowledged all of what this act means. We've taken it on board. We've assimilated it. It's part of our lives. We're performing it now. We are becoming that person who can do this act and who is therefore doing it now. And here, this then is the projection of an ideal self in the image of the act. And Deleuze calls this a doubling of the self. So again, there's this sense that this is all, it's not, there's nothing temporal as such. There's nothing about, we're talking about befores and afters and pasts and futures, but there's nothing about this which is happening in time. This is more your understanding of yourself in relation to an act. And so Deleuze can describe this as the doubling of the self, because the self is being projected into the act. Now you understand that you are big enough for this act. Now you can perform it. It can become a part of your life. You've accepted it. You've assimilated it. It's done. It's done. You are now that person. So there's this idea of projecting yourself into the act, doubling of the self. And the third time then is the future. And in this, and this is interesting, the event and act, he says, turn back against the self which has become their equal and smash it to pieces. I really like this idea. He's talking about what I guess we could call not really unpredictable, but it's the sheer creativity of the act. Once the act has been performed, has been carried out, the act then turns back on the self and smashes it. What does that mean? The self is no longer the self that it was before the act. The act itself changes the self that performed that act. So that self is now gone, and there's this new self in its place, which is quite a nice idea, right? And obviously is going to be linked to the idea of the eternal return for Deleuze. So the first thing to note about that before we look at the quote is just the talk of times, a first time, a second time, a third time, which brings to mind repetition, obviously. And that's exactly what Deleuze has in mind with this. So the self being divided into three, the divided self, and it's divided in such a way that there's this repetition. Not in time, not as in something happened yesterday, something's happening today, and something will happen tomorrow, but because time is static, it's a division of the self, in a sense, in an ideal sense, an understanding of yourself in relation to some concrete situation. So this temporal series is all repetition, but it's kind of just what I said, it's not historical in that sense. Repetition is never a historical fact, but rather the historical condition under which something new is effectively produced. It is not the historian's reflection which demonstrates a resemblance between Luther and Paul, between the Revolution of 1789 and the Roman Republic, etc. Rather, it is in the first place for themselves that the revolutionaries are determined to lead their lives as resuscitated Romans, before becoming capable of the act which they've begun by repeating in the mode of a proper past, therefore under conditions such that they necessarily identify with a figure from the historical past. Repetition is a condition of action before it is a concept of reflection. We produce something new only on condition that we repeat, once in the mode which constitutes the past, and once more in the present of metamorphosis. Moreover, what is produced, the absolutely new itself, is in turn nothing but repetition, the third repetition, this time by excess, the repetition of the future as eternal return. Cool. So that's kind of a nice quote. Hopefully some things come together from my description with that more kind of detailed example-ish quote of Deleuze's. So a couple of things to say about it then. I think the symbolic image in this quote then is the revolution, or one of the symbolic images would be the revolution, which is repeated once in preparation, the build-up, the getting oneself ready, making oneself into the kind of person that can do this. And so this is the past, repetition of the past. You're repeating. You're a resuscitated Roman, right? That's the idea of the repetition here. But again, not in a temporal sense, not in the sense of that we normally think of past, present, and future, but in a more engaged, lived sense. It's repeated twice in seeing oneself equal to the act, the metamorphosis of the self. This is the present. And then it's repeated a third time in the eternal return, where we've already discussed this, where being is becoming, i.e. primarily difference, change, movement, and that's the future. But all understood within this context of the self. So not a dimension which flows, not us flowing in a dimension. It's more subjective than that. It's more ideal than that. But that's the point. It's a structuring. It's an ordering kind of time for Deleuze. And he says this, and he italicizes this sentence, which is important to highlight then. Repetition is a condition of action before it is a concept of reflection. So it's in the lived action. It's in the lived experience. It's in the actual doing. It's concrete. And that is a central idea in Deleuze. Even though he's talking about this kind of idealized structure. He's talking about time as a structuring framework. Nothing moves. But what's moving is inside it. And that's where Deleuze is focusing. That's where, well, it's not where he's focusing, but he's bringing the emphasis on both. So we must set up time as this static structure first, but what makes where the movement arises is within it. And that's a key part of this, because as opposed to someone like Hegel, whose movement, if you can call it that, is all conceptual. It's all about definitions and concepts and this kind of semantic analysis. Deleuze wants to understand life. He wants to understand reality, concrete reality, not this abstract, idealized, conceptualized model of reality. So in order to understand that, we have to have the structure first, but the action happens within it. And Deleuze doesn't lose sight of that. And that's what makes this such an interesting book to read. Even though, like I said, we're talking about, and in the second half we talk about ideas in a kind of almost Platonic sense, but it's always linked back to concrete reality, human lived reality, rather than kind of getting caught in the conceptual and never getting out of it. Because if you do get stuck in that, you can just kind of go around in circles. And like I said, it appears like there's movement. You're generating movement in your philosophy, but it's kind of a fake movement. Nothing's actually moving. It's all conceptual. It's all intellectual, analytical. Deleuze brings it. He keeps himself tethered to actual existence. Which is good, I think. And the last thing I wanted to say about that quote is something I've already said about 10 times probably. There's nothing temporal in it. It's not about a movement of time. The focus is on how we understand ourselves in relation to a lived situation and proceed to act within it. Cool. So we saw then a couple of videos back the first synthesis, where the past and the future came out of the present. The present was the focus. The second synthesis, the present and the future came out of the past. The past was the focus. And in this, the third synthesis, the present and the past are aspects of the future. The past as the condition and the present as the agent. But there's an interesting point here with the third synthesis, because the third synthesis constitutes something new, such that the condition and the agent are both annihilated in it. And this means that we can think of the future then being unconditioned and independent of the agent, because it destroys them afterwards. It's this kind of clean slate. The once, and that's the eternal return. That's the way Deleuze views the eternal return anyway. It clears away everything that came before and imposes this new situation, whatever it might be. And so that's why for Deleuze, this is the ultimate synthesis. This is where we kind of finish. And it's fitting that it would then bring us back to the eternal return, because that's the linchpin of Deleuze's difference here. Being is becoming, difference, repetition, they're all included in this idea of the eternal return. And the third synthesis kind of finishes on that note as the final step in our journey through this chapter. Well, the final step thus far. So far, there's still plenty more to go in this chapter, but we've covered the core idea here with those three syntheses. So let's just kind of recap the whole picture by looking at how repetition and difference arise in all three of these syntheses. There's repetition in all of them, but in different modes, Deleuze says. In the first repetition, the repetition of habit, this is the present. Repetition is in the repeater. So it's lived. This is about, we talked about the organic contraction. That was the mechanism behind this synthesis. And the difference then is drawn off the repetition as contraction. So difference is drawn from the repetition that's taking place through these contractions. The second synthesis, the synthesis of memory or the past, the repetition here was repetition itself, the past as such, and that was represented in the different levels of the cone. And difference is not drawn off repetition like it was with habit, but it's included in the repetition, in the sense that we've got those different levels of the cone. That is the difference. So there's a tighter connection between repetition and difference in the second synthesis. And we'll see something similar in the third synthesis of time or the future. Repetition appears as that which is repeated. And we looked at, if that doesn't make that much sense to you, I wouldn't blame you, but the idea there is the divided self, carrying out those steps, the first time, second time, third time. There's the repetition. In this synthesis, Deleuze calls it that which is repeated. And he also calls this the royal repetition because, as I mentioned before, it annihilates the other two repetitions. Once it comes about, once it comes to fruition, the other two are annihilated. So no secret as to where Deleuze is placing his chips regarding past, present, and future. What about difference then? In the third synthesis, repetition is the thought and the production of the absolutely different, making it so that repetition is, for itself, difference in itself. And so that's what I meant when I said that this will bring repetition and difference together even more closely than we saw in the second synthesis. So that's kind of an interesting arc as well through the three syntheses. The first synthesis, difference was drawn off the repetition, so kind of separate from it. In the second synthesis, difference was included in the repetition, in those levels of the cone, past in itself. And in this synthesis, repetition itself is the thought and production of the absolutely different. So the two finally kind of merge into one here. And I just want to finish with a quick summarizing quote for you. The first synthesis concerns only the content and the foundation of time. The second, its ground. But beyond these, the third ensures the order, the totality of the series, and the final end of time. Nice, nothing really more to add to that, except that the third synthesis is, more structural. It brings coherence, structure to what? Order and structure to existence. Hence, and this is kind of an interesting phrasing, right? The final end of time. So we've come to the conclusion. Now we have the picture of time, not the end of time, as in, again, you'd be misunderstanding Deleuze to think that he's saying time finishes here or something, or that there's nothing after this, the eternal return, whatever, because it's static, because time now, with the third synthesis, the static synthesis, time is an ordered totality. It's engaged with, if you like, through the divided self and the series, but in that sense, we've kind of reached the end of time. We started out with the foundation, moved to the ground, and now we have the final picture, the order. We have time itself, which is this ordering framework. Nice. So let's hit a summary. First up, we looked at Descartes and Kant. So we talked about Descartes' cogito, the I think and the I am, and the way that Deleuze phrases these or understands these in terms of the determined and the undetermined, thought and existence, if you like. Then we looked at Kant and the same thing, the I think and the I am, but mediated through this passive self. And so this included the fracture of the I, fractured by time, creating this transcendental division, and the relation between thought and being. Then we came to Deleuze's third synthesis of time. This was the formal and empty order of time, and some of the key features of this: it's static, so it's structural, it's an order, not a kind of flowing of time. The fracture of the I appeared again, this time in the form of what Deleuze called the caesura, and the fracture here are different from Descartes and Kant because the split is into a before and an after, a fixed and a formal ordering in which a before and an after arise. And this synthesis can be understood either as a totality or as a series. If the former, the totality, we get an ordered whole. If the latter, the series, we get the divided self. We see the divided self arising in that series. Divided how? Divided into three. And working through that was the repetition, the first time, second time, third time, all understood as the way that you understand yourself in relation to the image of the act you are contemplating, or you have completed. Perhaps it's irrelevant whether the act has been completed or not. Remember, in this understanding of time. In this, then, we had the present, which was the agent, and the past, which was the condition of the future. Both of these are annihilated in this third synthesis. And repetition, as I mentioned, arises in the three times of the series. And interestingly, difference arises through repetition thinking and producing the absolutely different. So repetition and difference kind of come together, they coalesce in this final synthesis, such that repetition is, for itself, difference in itself. And that is that. That's where we are with this chapter so far. So in the next video, we'll start to look at Deleuze's psychoanalytic account of kind of specific rendering of how these three syntheses play out from the perspective of psychoanalysis. So that's something to look forward to if I can ever get my head around that. So we'll see what happens with that. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.